Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet one final time as she walked across the tarmac toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military base, creating waves of heat that distorted the horizon. At 28 years old, she had logged over 800 flight hours and completed 2 tours of duty, but nothing had prepared her for this mission. The briefing room had been unusually quiet that morning. Colonel Harrison, a man who rarely showed emotion, had struggled to maintain his composure as he outlined the operation. Intelligence reports confirmed that enemy forces had captured a strategic valley position and were preparing to launch a devastating attack on civilian populations. The enemy had positioned themselves in caves and fortified bunkers that conventional ground forces couldn't reach safely. Sarah's mission was clear but brutal: destroy the enemy stronghold using precision-guided munitions. The military brass called it a surgical strike, but everyone in that room knew the reality. This wasn't just about eliminating military targets. The enemy had deliberately positioned themselves among civilian structures, using innocent people as human shields. The collateral damage would be significant. As she performed her pre-flight checks, Sarah's mind wandered to her childhood in small-town Montana. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her about honor, duty, and the heavy weight of difficult decisions. He had also taught her to fly, taking her up in his old Cessna when she was just 12 years old. The freedom she felt in those moments had shaped her entire life, leading her to the Air Force Academy and eventually to this moment. The F-16's engine roared to life beneath her, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort. Today, it felt different. The aircraft she had come to love, the machine that represented everything she believed in about protecting freedom and democracy, was about to become an instrument of destruction that would haunt her forever. Ground control crackled through her headset, providing final weather updates and confirming her flight path. The target was approximately 200 miles northeast, nestled in a valley that had become a symbol of the ongoing conflict. Satellite imagery showed the enemy had spent months fortifying their position, turning ancient caves into modern weapons depots. Sarah taxied to the runway, her heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to match the aircraft's vibrations. She had carried out dozens of combat missions, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the colonel's expression during the briefing, or perhaps it was the way her fellow pilots had avoided eye contact afterward. Even Lieutenant Rodriguez, usually full of jokes and bravado, had remained silent. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with tremendous force, pressing her back into her seat. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the clear blue sky. The desert landscape spread out below her like a vast brown carpet, dotted with the occasional settlement or road. As she gained altitude, Sarah's training took over. She checked her instruments methodically, confirmed her navigation systems, and tested her communications equipment. Everything was functioning perfectly. The aircraft was loaded with 2 precision-guided bombs, each capable of devastating destruction. The weapons were designed to minimize collateral damage, but in a densely populated area, such precision was often meaningless. 40 minutes into her flight, Sarah reached the designated coordinates. The valley appeared peaceful from 20,000 feet, with small villages scattered along a winding river. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, and she could see people moving about their daily routines, unaware that death was circling high above them. Her targeting system locked onto the primary objective, a series of cave entrances that intelligence had identified as weapons storage facilities. The secondary target was a communications array positioned on a nearby ridge. Both targets were confirmed military installations, but they were surrounded by civilian buildings that would inevitably suffer damage. Sarah's finger hovered over the weapons release button as she made her attack run. The computer systems provided continuous updates on wind speed, distance, and trajectory calculations. Everything was perfect for a successful strike. The mission would be completed exactly as planned, and she would return to base having followed her orders to the letter. But as she descended to her attack altitude, something unexpected caught her attention. Through her aircraft's advanced optics, she noticed unusual movement in the target area. What she saw made her blood run cold. The intelligence reports had been wrong, or at least incomplete. The civilian population in the area wasn't just going about their normal daily routines. They were evacuating. Hundreds of people, mostly women and children, were streaming out of buildings and heading toward what appeared to be designated safe areas. Someone had warned them. Someone had told them to seek shelter or leave the area entirely. This wasn't the behavior of civilians being used as human shields by enemy forces. This was the organized evacuation of innocent people who had been given advance warning of an impending attack. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this new information. Had there been a leak in operational security? Had enemy forces somehow learned about the planned strike and used that knowledge to evacuate their own people while leaving military personnel in place? Or was something else entirely happening in that valley below? She circled the area once more, using her aircraft's sophisticated surveillance equipment to gather more information. What she discovered challenged everything she had been told during the mission briefing. The supposed enemy stronghold appeared to be largely empty of military personnel. The cave entrances that were supposed to house weapons showed no signs of recent activity. The communications array on the ridge appeared to be abandoned. Most disturbing of all, she began to recognize that many of the people evacuating weren't fleeing in panic. They were moving in organized groups, helping elderly, residents, and carrying children. This looked less like people running from enemy forces and more like a community that had been warned of an impending attack and was conducting an orderly evacuation. Sarah's training screamed at her to complete the mission as ordered. Her commanding officers had made it clear that this strike was critical to ongoing military operations. Failure to carry out her orders could result in court-martial and the end of her career. But her conscience, shaped by years of moral instruction and her father's lessons about doing what was right even when it was difficult, told her something was very wrong with this entire situation. With her finger still poised over the weapons, Release Captain Sarah Mitchell had to make the most important decision of her life. Sarah pulled back on the stick, climbing rapidly to gain time and distance while she processed what she had witnessed. Her radio crackled with static as ground control requested a status update. She keyed her microphone but found herself unable to speak. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she tell her commanding officers that their intelligence appeared to be completely wrong? Circling at 25,000 feet, Sarah used her aircraft's advanced camera systems to document everything she could see. The images were crystal clear, showing the evacuation proceeding in an orderly fashion. Children were being carried to safety by adults who moved with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first evacuation drill. Elderly residents were being helped onto carts and vehicles, while younger adults organized supply distributions. This wasn't the chaotic flight of people caught in the crossfire of war. This was a community that had been prepared for this moment, possibly for weeks or months. Someone had trained these civilians in evacuation procedures. Someone had established safe zones and supply caches. Someone had created a communication system that allowed for rapid mobilization of the entire population. The more Sarah observed, the more convinced she became that the intelligence reports had been fundamentally flawed. The supposed enemy stronghold looked more like a refugee settlement that had been abandoned temporarily for safety purposes. The weapons storage facilities appeared to be nothing more than storage caves for food and supplies. The communications equipment on the ridge looked more like civilian radio equipment than military hardware. Her fuel gauge showed she had approximately 20 minutes of flight time remaining before she would need to return to base. In that time, she had to make a decision that would affect not only her career, but potentially hundreds of innocent lives. The weight of command responsibility had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Sarah keyed her radio and contacted her ground controller. "Control, this is Eagle 7. I need to speak directly with Colonel Harrison immediately." The response came back quickly. "Eagle 7, you are cleared to proceed with your mission as briefed. Complete your objectives and return to base." "Control, I'm requesting direct communication with Colonel Harrison. I have new intelligence that affects this mission." There was a long pause before a different voice came over the radio. "Eagle 7, this is Colonel Harrison. What's your status?" Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "Colonel, I'm observing significant civilian evacuation activity in the target area. The intelligence we received appears to be inaccurate. I'm seeing organized evacuation procedures, not enemy military activity. Another pause. Eagle 7, you have your orders. The intelligence has been verified through multiple sources. Complete your mission. Sir, respectfully, I'm looking at the target area right now. There are hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, evacuating in organized groups. This doesn't match our briefing. Colonel Harrison's voice became more stern. Captain Mitchell, you are not in possession of all the intelligence information relevant to this operation. There are strategic considerations beyond what you can observe from your aircraft. You will complete your mission as ordered. Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She realized that her observations might not matter to the strategic planners. The mission had been authorized at levels far above Colonel Harrison, and the political pressure to proceed might be overwhelming any concern for civilian casualties. She made one more attempt. Colonel, I'm requesting permission to do one more reconnaissance pass before engaging targets. I want to confirm the absence of civilian activity in the immediate target areas. Permission denied, Eagle 7. You will proceed immediately with your attack run. That's a direct order. Sarah stared down at the peaceful valley below, watching as the last groups of evacuees moved toward safety. Her training told her to follow orders without question. Her oath as an officer demanded obedience to lawful commands from superior officers, but her conscience told her that dropping bombs on what appeared to be a civilian refugee settlement would be both morally wrong and strategically counterproductive. She thought about her father's stories from Vietnam, about the moral injuries that soldiers carried long after their physical wounds had healed. He had told her about moments when following orders meant doing things that haunted a person for the rest of their life. He had also told her about moments when courage meant refusing to do something that was clearly wrong, regardless of the consequences. As Sarah began her descent toward the target area, she noticed something else that hadn't been mentioned in the intelligence briefing. A white flag was flying from the highest point in the valley. It wasn't a surrender flag or a flag of truce in the traditional military sense. It was a civilian flag, the kind used by refugee settlements to identify themselves to aircraft and indicate their non-combatant status. She also noticed that many of the buildings in the area were marked with red crosses or red crescents, indicating their use as medical facilities or refugee shelters. These markings were clearly visible from the air and should have been noted in any reconnaissance reports. The fact that they hadn't been mentioned in her briefing suggested either incompetent intelligence gathering or deliberate omission of crucial information. Sarah's targeting computer began providing attack solutions as she descended to her bombing altitude. The precision-guided weapons would strike their targets with devastating accuracy, destroying the cave entrances and communications equipment exactly as planned. But they would also send shockwaves through the valley that could collapse buildings and cause casualties among any civilians who hadn't completed their evacuation. At 10,000 feet, Sarah could see individual people clearly through her aircraft's optics. An elderly man was helping a woman who appeared to be injured or disabled. A young mother was carrying two small children while trying to keep up with an evacuation group. A teenage boy was leading a group of even younger children toward what appeared to be a designated safe area. These weren't enemy combatants. These weren't military personnel. These were innocent people whose only crime was living in a valley that had strategic importance to military planners, sitting in air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away. Sarah's finger touched the weapons release button as her aircraft's computer systems provided final targeting confirmation. All systems were green. The weapons were armed and ready for release. Her flight path was perfect for accurate delivery of both bombs exactly on their designated targets. But Captain Sarah Mitchell couldn't bring herself to press that button. Instead, she pulled back on the stick and climbed rapidly away from the target area. Her radio immediately erupted with urgent calls from ground control demanding to know why she had aborted her attack run. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the chatter, ordering her to return immediately to complete her mission. Sarah keyed her microphone and spoke calmly. "Control, this is Eagle 7. I am unable to complete this mission as briefed. The target area contains significant civilian populations and does not match the intelligence provided. I am returning to base. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. The flight back to base was the longest 40 minutes of Sarah's life. Her radio remained mostly silent except for terse navigation updates from air traffic control. She knew that Colonel Harrison and his superiors were probably having heated discussions about her refusal to complete the mission. Court-martial proceedings would likely begin within hours of her landing. As her F-16 approached the airfield, Sarah could see military police vehicles positioned near the runway. This wasn't unusual for high-security operations, but something about their placement suggested they were there specifically for her. She had broken a direct order from a superior officer during a combat mission. In military law, this was one of the most serious offenses a soldier could commit. Sarah lowered her landing gear and touched down smoothly on the runway. As she taxied toward the hangar, she noticed that the usual ground crew was accompanied by several officers she didn't recognize. Colonel Harrison stood with his arms crossed, his expression grim. Next to him was a man in civilian clothes who appeared to be taking notes on a small tablet. After shutting down her aircraft systems, Sarah climbed down from the cockpit and was immediately approached by two military police officers. "Captain, Mitchell, you're to come with us immediately for debriefing," one of them said. His tone was professional but cold. The debriefing room was sterile and intimidating, with fluorescent lights that seemed too bright and a metal table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. Colonel Harrison sat across from her, flanked by the civilian she had seen on the runway and a woman in an Air Force uniform with insignia, indicating she was from the Judge Advocate General's office. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Harrison began, "you directly disobeyed a lawful order during a combat mission. Do you understand the severity of this action?" Sarah sat straight in her chair, maintaining eye contact. "Yes, sir. I understand that my actions constitute insubordination under military law. However, I believe I acted correctly based on the conditions I observed in the target area." The civilian leaned forward. "Captain, I'm Agent Williams from Military Intelligence. The information you received for this mission was accurate and had been verified through multiple independent sources. Your personal observations from 20,000 feet don't override months of careful intelligence gathering. With respect, sir, I wasn't observing from 20,000 feet. I descended to 8,000 feet and used advanced optics to document what I saw. I have digital recordings of the entire reconnaissance that clearly show organized civilian evacuation procedures and humanitarian markings on buildings throughout the target area." Agent Williams and Colonel Harrison exchanged glances. "Those recordings will be analyzed by intelligence specialists," the colonel said. "However, your job was to complete your mission, not to conduct independent intelligence gathering." The JAG officer spoke for the first time. "Captain Mitchell, given the seriousness of these charges, you have the right to legal representation before we proceed further with this questioning." Sarah nodded. "I request military counsel, ma'am. I also request that my aircraft's digital recordings be preserved as evidence." Over the next several hours, Sarah was processed through the military justice system with efficient but impersonal thoroughness. She was relieved of flight duties pending investigation, her security clearances were temporarily suspended, and she was confined to quarters except for meals and legal meetings. Her fellow pilots avoided eye contact when they saw her in the hallways, uncertain whether association with her might damage their own careers. But something unexpected happened 3 days after her confinement began. Lieutenant Rodriguez knocked on her door early in the morning, looking nervous and excited. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, handing her a tablet with a news article displayed on the screen. The headline read, "Civilian Refugee Camp Attacked by Unknown Aircraft. Hundreds Dead." The article described a devastating bombing attack on what was described as a peaceful refugee settlement in the same valley where Sarah had refused to drop her bombs. According to the report, over 300 civilians had been killed, mostly women, children, and elderly residents. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the details. The attack had occurred exactly 24 hours after her aborted mission. Someone else had been sent to complete what she had refused to do. The bombs had struck the exact targets she had been assigned, with predictably horrific results. "There's more," Rodriguez said quietly. "Check the international news." Sarah scrolled to additional articles that showed the global reaction to the attack. Photographs of destroyed buildings and grieving survivors filled the screen. International human rights organizations were calling it a war crime. Allied nations were demanding investigations. Protesters were gathering outside embassies worldwide. Most importantly, she saw photographs taken by international journalists who had reached the scene. The images confirmed everything she had observed from her aircraft. Red cross markings on destroyed buildings, the remains of clearly civilian infrastructure and debris from what appeared to have been schools, clinics, and housing for displaced families. "They sent Captain Brooks to finish the mission," Rodriguez whispered. "He didn't question the orders, just dropped the bombs exactly as briefed and returned to base." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. Captain Brooks was a good pilot and a decent man, but he was also someone who never questioned authority. He had completed his mission exactly as ordered, probably never knowing that he was bombing a refugee settlement rather than a military target. Later that day, Sarah's military attorney, Major Patricia Chen, arrived with news that would change everything. "Captain Mitchell, there have been some developments in your case that you need to know about. The international outcry over this bombing has reached the highest levels of government. Congressional leaders are demanding investigations, and several allied nations are threatening to withdraw from the coalition unless there's accountability." Major Chen opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "More importantly, preliminary analysis of your aircraft's digital recordings has confirmed your observations. The target area was indeed a civilian refugee settlement, not a military stronghold. The intelligence reports that authorized this mission appear to have been either severely flawed or deliberately falsified." Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. She had been right to refuse the mission, but her refusal had only delayed the inevitable tragedy by 24 hours. "There's something else," Major Chen continued. "Agent Williams, the intelligence officer who questioned you, has disappeared. His office says he's been reassigned to another project, but they won't say where or when. Colonel Harrison is also being transferred immediately to a desk job at the Pentagon." The implications were becoming clear. Someone had wanted that refugee settlement destroyed, and they had been willing to use falsified intelligence reports to make it happen. Sarah's refusal to complete the mission had exposed the deception, but it hadn't prevented the ultimate tragedy. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we fight," Major Chen replied. "Your actions may have saved your own soul, Captain Mitchell, but we're going to use your case to expose what really happened in that valley. The truth needs to come out, and you're going to be the key witness." Sarah realized that her real battle was just beginning. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, military officials, and family members of bombing victims who had flown in from around the world. Sarah sat at a long table facing a panel of senators and representatives, her dress uniform perfectly pressed but her hands slightly trembling as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. 3 weeks had passed since the bombing, and the international crisis had only deepened. The United Nations had launched its own investigation, several allied nations had suspended military cooperation, and domestic protests were growing daily. The administration was under enormous pressure to provide answers and accountability. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order. "Captain Mitchell, you are here today because your actions on the day in question may provide crucial insight into how this tragedy occurred. You have been granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for your complete and truthful testimony." Sarah's attorney had negotiated the immunity deal after it became clear that the military brass wanted to make her a scapegoat for the entire incident. They had initially planned to court-martial her for insubordination, while quietly covering up the intelligence failures that led to the bombing. But the international attention had made such a cover-up impossible. "Captain Mitchell," began Senator Robert Hayes, a former Marine colonel, "please describe in your own words what you observed during your reconnaissance of the target area." Sarah had rehearsed this testimony dozens of times, but speaking in front of the crowded hearing room felt surreal. She described her observations methodically: the organized evacuation, the humanitarian markings on buildings, the absence of military activity, and the clear indicators that the intelligence reports had been wrong. Did you communicate these observations to your commanding officers? Senator Hayes asked. Yes, sir. I requested direct communication with Colonel Harrison and informed him that the intelligence appeared to be inaccurate. I described the civilian evacuation activities I was witnessing and requested permission to conduct additional reconnaissance before proceeding with the attack. And how did Colonel Harrison respond? He ordered me to proceed immediately with the bombing mission. He said I wasn't in possession of all relevant intelligence and that there were strategic considerations beyond what I could observe from my aircraft. The hearing room buzzed with whispered conversations as Sarah described her final exchange with Colonel Harrison and her decision to abort the mission. Several senators took notes furiously, while others leaned back in their chairs, with expressions of concern or skepticism. Senator Maria Rodriguez, known for her advocacy on human rights issues, leaned forward. Captain Mitchell, you mentioned that you documented your observations using your aircraft's recording systems. Can you tell us what those recordings showed? Yes, ma'am. The recordings clearly documented the civilian nature of the activities in the target area. They showed families evacuating with children and elderly residents, buildings marked with red crosses indicating medical facilities, and white flags indicating non-combatant status. Most importantly, they showed no evidence of the military activities described in our intelligence briefing. Major Chen had provided copies of the digital recordings to the committee, and selected portions were displayed on large screens throughout the hearing room. The images were devastating. Clear footage of what was obviously a refugee settlement being evacuated by desperate but organized civilians. Senator Hayes studied the images on his screen. Captain Mitchell, these recordings contradict the intelligence reports that authorized this mission. In your professional opinion, how could such a significant discrepancy have occurred? Sarah had been dreading this question because answering it honestly would force her to accuse her own chain of command of either gross incompetence or deliberate deception. Senator, based on what I observed and documented, I believe the intelligence reports were either severely flawed due to inadequate reconnaissance, or they were deliberately falsified to justify a mission that wouldn't have been authorized if the true nature of the target area had been known. The hearing room erupted in noise as reporters rushed to file updated stories and committee members conferred urgently with their staff. Senator Williams gavelled for order and called a brief recess. During the break, Major Chen pulled Sarah aside. You did well, she said. But they're about to bring up Captain Brooks and what happened after you refused the mission. Are you prepared for that? Sarah nodded grimly. Captain Brooks had completed the same mission exactly 24 hours after her refusal, using the same intelligence reports and targeting the same locations. The results had been catastrophic, but Brooks had been following orders exactly as any pilot was trained to do. When the hearing resumed, Senator Rodriguez addressed the elephant in the room. Captain Mitchell, after you refused to complete this mission, another pilot was sent to carry out the same operation. Captain James Brooks dropped his bombs on the exact targets you had been assigned. Were you aware this would happen? No, ma'am. I hoped that my report of civilian activity in the target area would lead to a re-evaluation of the intelligence and possibly a cancellation of the mission entirely. Do you blame Captain Brooks for what happened? Sarah had thought about this, questioned constantly over the past 3 weeks. Captain Brooks was a good pilot who had followed his orders exactly as he had been trained to do. He couldn't have known that the intelligence reports were wrong, and he had no reason to question orders that came down through proper channels. No, ma'am, I don't blame Captain Brooks. He was given the same flawed intelligence that I received, and he followed his orders as any military officer is trained to do. The responsibility lies with whoever provided false intelligence and whoever authorized the mission to proceed, despite evidence that the intelligence was wrong. Senator Hayes leaned forward. Captain Mitchell, let's talk about that evidence. When you reported your observations to Colonel Harrison, you provided him with real-time intelligence that contradicted the mission briefing. What should have happened? At that point, standard operating procedure would be to halt the mission pending verification of the conflicting intelligence. At minimum, additional reconnaissance should have been ordered to resolve the discrepancy. The mission should not have proceeded until the true nature of the target area was confirmed. But that's not what happened. No, sir. I was ordered to proceed immediately with the bombing and when I refused, another pilot was sent to complete the same mission using the same flawed intelligence. The testimony continued for hours, with senators from both parties asking detailed questions about military procedures, intelligence gathering, and command responsibility. Sarah answered each question as honestly as she could, knowing that her words were being broadcast around the world and would likely determine not only her own future, but also the future of everyone involved in the incident. Late in the afternoon, Senator Williams asked the question that Sarah had been both expecting and dreading. "Captain Mitchell, given everything that has happened, do you regret your decision to refuse that direct order?" Sarah looked out at the packed hearing room, seeing the faces of journalists, military officials, and family members of bombing victims. She thought about Captain Brooks, who was now facing his own investigation, despite having followed orders exactly. She thought about Colonel Harrison and Agent Williams, whose careers were effectively over. She thought about the hundreds of innocent people who had died, because someone had been willing to falsify intelligence reports to justify an unjustifiable attack. "No, ma'am," she said firmly. "I don't regret refusing to bomb what I knew to be a civilian refugee settlement. I only regret that my refusal wasn't enough to prevent the tragedy that followed." The hearing room fell completely silent for several seconds before Senator Williams spoke again. "Captain Mitchell, you are dismissed with the committee's thanks for your testimony. This hearing is adjourned." As Sarah left the witness table, she realized that her testimony had probably ended her military career, but it had also exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the military and intelligence communities. The real battle for justice was just beginning. 2 months after the congressional hearing, Sarah found herself in an unlikely place, a refugee camp on the border between two war-torn countries, working alongside international humanitarian workers to provide aid to displaced families. Her military career was officially over, but her new mission felt more important than any she had flown in an F-16. The congressional investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Agent Williams, the intelligence officer who had mysteriously disappeared, had been working with a private military contractor that stood to gain billions of dollars from an expanded conflict in the region. The falsified intelligence reports had been designed to justify military operations that would require extensive private contractor support. Colonel Harrison, it turned out, had known the intelligence was questionable, but had been pressured by Pentagon officials who were themselves being influenced by contractor lobbyists. The entire chain of command had been compromised by people who profited from war and had no concern for civilian casualties. Captain Brooks had been cleared of all charges after investigators confirmed that he had acted appropriately based on the information available to him. But the psychological impact of learning that he had bombed innocent civilians had been devastating. He was receiving counseling and had requested transfer to a non-combat role. Sarah's testimony had been the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Her aircraft recordings had provided undeniable proof that the intelligence reports were false, and her refusal to complete the mission had created a paper trail that investigators could follow all the way to the top of the corruption network. But justice in Washington moved slowly, and Sarah couldn't bear to wait for politicians and lawyers to sort out accountability while real people continued to suffer from the consequences of the bombing. She had resigned her commission and used her savings to travel to the region where the attack had occurred. The refugee camp where she now worked housed over 5,000 people, many of whom had fled their homes in the valley after the bombing. Sarah's engineering background and leadership experience made her valuable to the aid organizations, but it was her personal connection to the tragedy that gave her work special meaning. On a humid Thursday morning, Sarah was helping to distribute water when she noticed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing alone near the camp's main gate. The child was staring intently at something in the distance, her small hands gripping the wire fence that surrounded the camp. Sarah approached carefully, speaking in the few words of the local language she had learned. The girl looked up with large, serious eyes and then pointed toward the horizon where mountains were visible through the morning haze. "Home," the girl said in accented English. "My home is there." Through a translator, Sarah learned that the girl's name was Amara, and that she had lost her parents and 2 siblings in the bombing. She had been evacuated with her grandmother, but the old woman had died from pneumonia 2 weeks after arriving at the refugee camp. Now Amara was alone, one of dozens of orphaned children in the camp. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself spending more and more time with Amara and the other orphaned children. She helped them with basic English lessons, organized games, and activities, and slowly began to understand the full human cost of the mission she had refused to complete. Amara was remarkably intelligent and curious about everything. She asked Sarah endless questions about life in America, about flying, and about why the bombs had come to her valley. Sarah struggled to find age-appropriate ways to explain the complex political and military factors that had led to the tragedy. One evening, as they sat outside Sarah's tent sharing a simple meal, Amara asked the question that Sarah had been dreading. "Miss Sarah, were you the pilot who was supposed to drop the bombs on my village?" Sarah had never directly told Amara about her role in the events, but the girl was perceptive and had probably overheard conversations between aid workers. Sarah took a deep breath and decided that Amara deserved honesty. "Yes, Amara, I was supposed to drop bombs on your village, but I saw that there were families like yours there, so I refused to do it. But another pilot came the next day and dropped the bombs anyway." Amara was quiet for a long time, staring up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. Finally, she spoke. "I'm glad you didn't drop the bombs, Miss Sarah, but I'm sad that the other pilot did." "I'm sad about that too, Amara. I'm very, very sad that I couldn't stop it from happening." The girl reached over and took Sarah's hand. "You tried to stop it. That's what matters." Several weeks later, Sarah received unexpected news that would change everything once again. Major Chen called with an update on the legal proceedings in Washington. "Sarah, the Justice Department has filed charges against 17 people involved in the intelligence falsification conspiracy. Agent Williams was arrested trying to flee the country with over $2 million in offshore accounts. 3 Pentagon officials have been charged with corruption, and the private contractor at the center of the scheme has lost all government contracts and is facing criminal prosecution." Sarah listened to the news with mixed feelings. Justice was being served, but it couldn't bring back the people who had died or restore the lives that had been destroyed. "There's something else," Major Chen continued. "Congress has passed new legislation requiring independent verification of all intelligence reports before military strikes can be authorized. They're calling it the Mitchell Protocol, after your testimony." The idea that her actions might prevent future tragedies gave Sarah some sense that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. But the legislation was just words on paper, unless military personnel were willing to act on their conscience when faced with questionable orders. That evening, Sarah shared the news with Amara and some of the other children. She tried to explain that new laws would help protect other villages from what had happened to theirs. Amara listened carefully and then asked, "Miss Sarah, will you teach other pilots to be brave like you were?" The question sparked an idea that would define the next chapter of Sarah's life. Maybe her real mission wasn't finished. Maybe she could do more good by training future military officers to think critically about their orders and to have the courage to refuse missions that violated their conscience. Over the following months, Sarah began developing a plan to return to the United States and establish a program that would teach military ethics and moral courage to pilots and other service members. She would use her experience and the lessons learned from the tragedy to help prevent future incidents. But first, she had promises to keep to Amara and the other children in the refugee camp. She had committed to helping them find new homes and rebuild their lives, and she would see that commitment through no matter how long it took. As Sarah tucked Amara into bed that night, the young girl looked up at her with a serious expression. 5 years later, Sarah stood at the podium of the United States Air Force Academy's largest auditorium, looking out at 800 cadet faces eager to learn about military ethics and moral courage. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of air, conditioning, and the occasional shuffle of note-taking materials. Her journey from disgraced pilot to respected educator had been long and difficult, but it had ultimately led to changes that were saving lives around the world. The Mitchell Protocol had prevented at least 12 potential bombing incidents where intelligence reports were later found to be questionable. More importantly, a new generation of military officers was being trained to think critically about their orders and to have the courage to question authority when necessary. Today I want to tell you about the hardest decision I ever made as a pilot, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. It was a decision that ended my flying career but helped expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of our military and intelligence communities. She had told this story hundreds of times to classes of cadets, young officers, and international military academies around the world. But it never got easier, especially when she reached the part about the children who had died despite her efforts to prevent the bombing. As Sarah described her observations over the valley and her decision to refuse the bombing order, she watched the cadets' faces carefully. Some showed shock at the idea of disobeying a direct order. Others nodded with understanding as they grasped the moral complexity of the situation. A few looked skeptical, as if they couldn't believe such a conspiracy could exist within their own military. The question I want you to consider, Sarah continued, is not whether I made the right decision. The question is, what would you have done in that situation? How do you balance your duty to follow orders with your responsibility to protect innocent life? A hand shot up in the front row. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, a young woman from Texas who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, asked the question that always came up during these presentations. Ma'am, if everyone started questioning orders and making their own decisions about which missions to complete, wouldn't that undermine military discipline and effectiveness? Sarah smiled. It was a good question, one that got to the heart of military culture and the delicate balance between obedience and moral responsibility. That's exactly the right question to ask, Cadet Walsh. Military discipline is essential to effective operations, and the chain of command exists for good reasons. But blind obedience to illegal or immoral orders is not discipline, it's complicity. Your oath is to defend the Constitution and protect innocent life, not to follow orders without question. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a photograph of Amara, now 13 years old and attending school in Germany where she had been adopted by a loving family. Sarah had stayed in touch with her throughout the years, watching her grow from a traumatized refugee into a confident young woman who spoke 4 languages and dreamed of becoming a doctor. This is Amara, Sarah said. She lost her family in the bombing that I was originally ordered to carry out. She's now in her 2nd year of gymnasium in Munich and writes to me regularly about her studies and her plans for the future. Every time I receive one of her letters, I'm reminded that our decisions as military officers affect real people, with real lives and real dreams. Another cadet raised his hand. Ma'am, what happened to the other people involved in the conspiracy? Sarah pulled up another slide showing newspaper headlines from the trials that had concluded 2 years earlier. Agent Williams was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy and treason. 3 Pentagon officials received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The private contractor executives were sentenced to terms between 10 and 20 years, and their company was permanently banned from government contracts. She paused before continuing. Colonel Harrison received a reprimand and early retirement, but no prison time. The investigators concluded that while he should have questioned the intelligence more thoroughly, he was ultimately a victim of the conspiracy, rather than a participant in it. The presentation continued for another hour, with Sarah describing the changes that had been implemented since the incident. The Mitchell Protocol required independent verification of all targeting intelligence. New whistleblower protections encouraged service members to report questionable orders. Most importantly, military ethics training had been expanded to emphasize moral courage alongside traditional military virtues. After the formal presentation, Sarah always held informal question and answer sessions where cadets could ask more personal questions. These conversations were often the most meaningful part of her visits. Cadet Walsh approached after most of the other students had left. Ma'am, I have to ask, do you ever regret giving up your flying career? I mean, you were an F-16 pilot. That's what I want to do more than anything. Sarah looked out the window at the Colorado mountains, thinking about all the flights she would never take and all the missions she would never fly. The loss of her aviation career had been devastating, But it had led to something even more important. "I miss flying every single day," she said honestly. "There's nothing quite like the freedom and responsibility of controlling a fighter aircraft. But I found a different kind of mission now. Instead of protecting freedom with weapons, I'm protecting it with education and moral courage. I'm helping to ensure that future pilots like you will never face the situation I faced." That evening, Sarah returned to her hotel room and found an email waiting from Amara. The young woman was now fluent in English and wrote with the thoughtful wisdom of someone who had experienced tragedy but refused to be defeated by it. "Dear Miss Sarah," the email began, "I hope your visit to the Air Force Academy went well today. I wanted you to know that I've decided to study international law instead of medicine. I want to work on preventing the kind of tragedy that happened to my village from happening to other people. You taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to participate in something you know is wrong. I want to spend my life helping other people have the courage to make that choice." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading the email. Amara's decision to dedicate her life to preventing conflicts and protecting civilians was the ultimate validation of the choice Sarah had made that day over the valley. The next morning, Sarah received a call from the Academy's commandant asking if she would consider a permanent position developing a new curriculum on military ethics and moral leadership. It would mean giving up her consulting work and her frequent travel, but it would allow her to have a deeper impact on military education. As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about the hundreds of young officers she had taught over the past 5 years. Many of them were now serving in combat zones around the world, making split-second decisions that could affect innocent lives. If her training helped even one of them make the right choice in a morally complex situation, it would be worth any sacrifice. She also thought about Captain Brooks, who had eventually found his own path to redemption by leaving active duty and joining a humanitarian organization that cleared unexploded ordnance from former war zones. He had written to her recently, describing how he was using his military skills to make areas safe for returning refugees. That afternoon, Sarah called the commandant and accepted the position. Her new mission would be to ensure that future generations of military officers understood that true courage sometimes meant refusing orders, and that protecting innocent life was always more important than following the chain of command. 3 months later, as Sarah stood in front of her first regular class of ethics students, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost her wings, but she had found her true calling. She was no longer a pilot, but she was still serving her country and protecting freedom in the most important way possible. And somewhere in Germany, a young woman named Amara was studying international law and dreaming of a world where children would never again have to flee from bombs dropped by pilots who knew their orders were wrong, but followed them anyway. The war Sarah had been sent to end had indeed ended, but not through the violence she had been ordered to carry out. It had ended through truth, courage, and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when faced with moral choices that would define not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others. Sarah's F-16 had been sent to end it all, but instead her conscience had ended the war and saved not just her own soul but the future of military ethics itself.